Any sailor knows that specific moment when the ship starts moving the wrong way at the wrong moment. You watch the breakwater light, and instead of moving past it, it stays in the same position on the bridge window. The bow is swinging too slowly, and the entire hull acts like a sail, sliding you sideways toward the stones. You realize the rudder is no longer enough. We were arriving at a commercial port on the western coast of Italy. The vessel was a pure car and truck carrier, a P-Suisse. She was about 180 meters long, with that high box-like structure that makes these ships notorious for catching the wind. We were in ballast condition, meaning we were riding high out of the water. The enormous freeboard acted like a solid wall against the elements. The pilot had boarded about 2 miles off the entrance. He was an experienced man, quiet and focused. The plan was simple: enter the breakwaters, turn to starboard, and proceed to the Ro-Ro terminal. The weather report predicted a northwesterly wind of force 4 or 5. It was breezy, but nothing a ship of this size usually worries about. We had one tug ordered, which was waiting for us inside the harbor basin. The approach channel was straightforward, but not particularly wide. On our starboard side lay the outer breakwater, a long arm of concrete and rock protecting the inner harbor. To port, there were shoals marked by buoys. Before I tell you what happened next, please consider subscribing. It helps this channel reach more sailors. This happened in 1998 on a routine commercial voyage. The bridge team consisted of myself, the pilot, the third officer, and a helmsman. The chief officer was forward with the anchor party, and the second officer was aft. Everything felt routine. The radar showed the channel clearly, and visually the visibility was good. We were making about 8 knots, slowing down gradually as we approached the breakwater heads. As we closed the distance to the entrance to about 1 mile, the wind began to freshen. It wasn't a sudden squall, but a steady increase in pressure on the port quarter. The anemometer climbed from 20 knots to 25, then touched 30. Because we were high out of the water, the effect was immediate. The ship began to carry leeway. The bow wanted to turn into the wind, but the overall drift was setting us toward the starboard breakwater. The pilot ordered 10 degrees to port to counteract the drift. The helmsman executed the order. I watched the rudder angle indicator show the movement, then looked back at the gyro repeater. The heading remained steady, but our track over the ground was sliding to starboard. We were crabbing. This is normal for car carriers, but the angle was getting larger than comfortable. Starboard 10, the pilot corrected, trying to bring the bow back to the center of the channel. The helmsman turned the wheel. The ship was sluggish. At this slow speed, the flow of water over the rudder was not strong, enough to overcome the force of the wind on the hull. We were drifting closer to the red markers on the starboard side. The pilot looked at me. "She's heavy on the helm, Captain," he said. I nodded. "Give her 20 degrees, I suggested. The pilot agreed and gave the order. The rudder went over to 20. We waited. A large ship takes time to react. You count the seconds in your head. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. The bow started to swing, but very slowly. The drift, however, did not stop. The wind was pushing the entire broadside of the ship sideways. We were now half a mile from the entrance. The gap between the breakwater heads looked narrower than usual from this angle. If we continued on this vector, we would clear the entrance, but we would be uncomfortably close to the rocks on the starboard side. The pilot made a decision. "Slow ahead," he ordered. He wanted to reduce speed to give us more time to align. I understood his logic, but I worried about steerage. As soon as the engine RPM dropped, the rudder became even less effective. The propeller wash, which helps the rudder bite, decreased. The wind, however, did not decrease. It pushed harder. The bow fell off slightly to starboard, toward the danger. The helmsman reported, "She is not answering well, sir." I stepped out to the bridge wing. The wind was whistling now, perhaps 35 knots. Looking aft, I could see our wake was at a significant angle to our heading. We were sliding sideways faster than we were moving forward. The breakwater was looming larger on the starboard bow. "Hard to port," the pilot ordered, trying to swing the bow away from the wall. The rudder went hard over. Nothing happened. The ship just drifted. The reduction in speed had been a mistake. We had lost the bite on the rudder just when we needed it most. I walked back inside. "Pilot, we need power," I said calmly. "We are losing steerage." He hesitated. Increasing speed meant hitting the gap faster, leaving less room for error. but without speed, we were just a drifting box. "Half ahead," the pilot ordered. The engine room telegraph rang. I watched the RPM gauge. The needle moved up slowly. The engine responded, but it takes time for a large vessel to build momentum. The vibration on the deck plates increased. We needed the propeller wash to hit the rudder, hard. We were now a quarter-mile from the entrance. The starboard breakwater seemed to reach out for us. The heavy swell rebounding off the breakwater was starting to affect us too, pushing the bow erratically. The ship was in a fight between the wind on the hull and the water on the rudder. "She's coming left slowly," the helmsman said. I looked at the radar. The variable range marker showed we were closing on the starboard wall. The bow was swinging left, which was good, but the stern was kicking out to starboard, toward the rocks. This is the pivot point effect. When you turn hard port, the stern swings starboard. We were clearing the bow, but swinging. The stern into the danger zone. The pilot realized this too. He looked at the distance. It was going to be tight. "Midships," he ordered, trying to stop the swing before the stern swung too wide, but the momentum was already there. The ship was heavy, and she was turning. The wind caught the starboard quarter, now helping the turn but pushing the stern further toward the breakwater. We were committed. There was no room to turn around, and stopping would only leave us at the mercy of the wind. We had to thread the needle. The tension on the bridge was a quiet physical weight. No one spoke unnecessary words. We just watched the distance to the concrete wall decreasing. The bow of the vessel crossed the line between the breakwater heads. From the bridge wing, the change in sound was noticeable. The steady roar of the wind was interrupted by the deflection from the concrete wall on our starboard side, creating a buffering effect. However, the wind acting on the hull aft of the bridge was still full force. We were moving at about 7 knots over the ground. This was faster than we wanted for entering a confined basin, but we needed the speed for steerage. The problem with a pure car carrier is the windage area. The side of the ship is essentially a sail of 3,000 square meters. As the bow entered the shelter of the harbor, the wind pressure on the forward section dropped slightly, but the pressure on the stern remained high. This caused a twisting effect. The stern was being pushed sideways toward the starboard breakwater, while the bow was relatively free. The helmsman called out the heading. We were steady on the compass, but the view from the wing told a different story. The gap between our starboard quarter and the end of the breakwater was shrinking. The drift angle was close to 15 degrees. We were sliding through the entrance rather than driving through it. "Starboard 10, the pilot ordered. He was trying to check the swing. We had initiated a turn to port to enter the channel, which naturally swings the stern to starboard. Combined with the wind, this swing was becoming dangerous. By putting the rudder to starboard, he hoped to push the stern back to port, away from the concrete. The rudder indicator moved. The ship hesitated. At this speed and with this wind, the rudder forces were barely balancing the aerodynamic forces. We were not turning, we were just fighting to hold our line. "Stern is closing on the green light," the second officer reported from the aft station. His voice on the radio was flat, but the frequency of his updates increased. "Distance 20 meters, closing." 20 meters for a ship of this size is nothing. It is less than the width of the vessel. A sudden gust or a moment of rudder failure would result in contact. "Hard starboard," the pilot said. "Kick ahead." I moved the telegraph to full ahead. This is a standard maneuver to gain steering leverage without increasing the ship's speed too much. You apply maximum rudder and maximum power for a short burst. The propeller wash hits the angled rudder, creating a strong lateral thrust at the stern. In this case, with the rudder hard to starboard, the thrust would kick the stern to port away from the breakwater. The engine load indicator jumped. The vibration shuddered through the bridge floor. We held it for 10 seconds. Distance 15 meters. Steady. The radio crackled. The kick was working. The stern movement to starboard paused. The wash from the propeller was fighting the wind. "Stop engine midships," the pilot ordered. We could not hold the kick too long. While hard starboard moves the stern away from danger, it also points the bow toward the danger. We were now inside the harbor, and the channel curved to port. If we kept the rudder to starboard, we would run the bow aground on the breakwater rip-a-rap. We had to balance the two ends of the ship. The vessel slid past the breakwater head. We were inside. The water was calmer here, with no ocean swell, but the wind was still strong. The layout of this port meant the wind funneled through the container terminal cranes and hit us on the beam. Now we had a new problem. We were inside the turning basin, but we were carrying 7 knots of speed. The stopping distance of a car carrier in ballast is not short. The wind was pushing us bodily toward the shoals on the leeward side of the channel. "Dead slow ahead," the pilot ordered. He needed to maintain just enough flow over the rudder to steer, but we had to shed speed. I looked at the Doppler log. 6.8 knots, 6.5 knots. The speed was dropping slowly. The tug was waiting for us about half a mile ahead. It was a tractor tug, capable of good maneuvering, but it could not make fast to our line if we were moving this fast. "Tug is standing by on the port bow," the third officer said. "Tell him to come alongside, but watch the speed," I told the pilot. "We are too fast for him." The pilot picked up the VHF. "Tug 1, we are coming in hot. Can you push on the port shoulder to help the turn?" The tug master replied, "Copy, pushing port shoulder." We needed to make a 90-degree turn to starboard to reach our berth. Usually you slow down, pass a line to the tug, and let the tug pull you round. Today, we couldn't wait for the line. The wind was blowing us past our turning point. If we missed the turn, we would end up in the shallow water near the grain terminal. "Hard starboard," the pilot ordered again. The ship began to turn, but the wind on the port side was resisting the turn. The vessel wanted to weathercock, to turn its bow into the wind, but the wind was slightly aft of the beam, pushing us straight sideways. The tug moved in. I saw the mast of the tug disappear under the flared bow of our ship. A moment later, I felt the slight bump as the tug made contact with the hull. The tug applied full power, pushing the bow to starboard. Between the rudder and the tug, the bow started to come around, but now the speed was the enemy. As we turned broadside to the channel to line up with the berth, the wind caught the full length of the hull. We were acting like a giant brake. "Half astern," I suggested. The pilot looked at the chart. We had room behind us, but not much. "Slow astern," he corrected. He was cautious about using astern power on a car carrier during a turn. "The propeller walk." The tendency of the stern to swing sideways when in reverse on a right-handed propeller pulls the stern to port. We were turning starboard. Backing the engine would pull the stern to port, which would actually help the turn, but it would also kill the rudder effectiveness. "What would you have done in a moment like this?" I acknowledged the order. "Slow astern." The engine reversed. The braking effect was weak against the wind. The ship was still sliding sideways toward the lee shore buoys. The distance to the shallow water was 3 cables and closing. "She is not checking the speed enough," I said. "Wind is taking us." The pilot nodded. "Half astern, tug, full power." The vibration returned, different this time. The shudder of cavitation as the propeller bit into the water in reverse. The speed log showed 4 knots, then 3.5. We were slowing, but the drift was increasing. Without forward motion, the keel offers less resistance to sliding sideways. We were stopping, but we were also being blown rapidly toward the mud. "Bow thruster is ready," I reminded him. We had not used it yet because of the speed. Now that we were under 3 knots, it might be effective. "Thruster full starboard," the pilot said immediately. I walked to the console and pushed the lever. The electric motor whined. The bow thruster on this ship was 1,200 kilowatts. It pushed a jet of water to the left, forcing the bow to the right. So now we had the tug pushing the bow, the thruster pushing the bow, and the engine pulling the stern to port. The ship began to rotate almost in place. We were pivoting, but the sideways drift continued. We were crabbing toward the berth, but also toward the crane legs on the quay. A car carrier is like a balloon. It lands where the wind decides unless you pin it down. "Stop engine," I said. "Speed is 2 knots. "Dead slow ahead," the pilot countered. "We need to move forward to the berth, not just drift sideways." He was right. If we just drifted, we might hit the quay at the wrong angle. We needed forward motion to land flat. It was a balancing act. Too much speed, we hit the fender hard. Too little, the wind blows us onto the crane rails. We were 200 meters from the quay. The line handlers were waiting. The water in the basin was churned up by our thruster and the tug's wash. The wind was still singing in the antenna rigging, steady at 30 knots. "Get the heaving lines ready," I shouted to the bridge wing. The gap was closing, but the angle looked wrong. The stern was coming in faster than the bow. We were going to land stern first. If we weren't careful, And on a ship with a quarter ramp, hitting the stern corner is an expensive mistake. The distance to the quay was now less than 50 meters. The wind was still pressing the ship broadly against the fenders, but the angle was the immediate concern. The stern was closing the gap much faster than the bow. On a car carrier, the stern ramp is a complex piece of hydraulic machinery. If we hit the concrete corner with the ramp structure, we could twist the hinges or damage the hull plating before the fenders could do their job. "Stop engine," the pilot said. "Tug, full pull back." The tug, which had been pushing on the port shoulder to help the turn, now had to switch roles immediately. The tugmaster slackened his pushing force, reversed his thrust, and tightened the tow line he had secured earlier. He needed to act as a brake against the lateral drift. I walked to the bridge wing to get a better view of the aft section. The second officer was reporting distances calmly, but the urgency was clear in the numbers. Stern 15 meters, bow 30 meters. The ship was not parallel. We were coming in at an angle. "Hard port," the pilot ordered. "Dead slow ahead." This was the corrective kick. By putting the rudder hard over to port and applying a burst of engine power, the pilot intended to swing the bow to port and, more importantly, kick the stern to starboard, away from the quay. It was a delicate move, too much power, and we would surge forward along the berth, potentially overshooting our marking. Too little, and the wind would slam the stern into the dock. The engine answered. The water churned around the stern. For a few seconds, the ship didn't seem to react. Then slowly, the stern movement checked. The gap stopped shrinking so rapidly. The bow began to swing in, aligning the vessel parallel to the berth. "Stop engine, midships," the pilot said. Now we were drifting sideways, almost parallel, with the wind doing all the work. The tug was pulling full power to slow the landing, fighting the 30-knot breeze. "Send the spring lines," I ordered the officers on the radio. On the deck below, the bosun and the crew were ready. The heaving lines flew across the gap, landing on the concrete. The linesmen on the shore ran to grab them, pulling the heavy messenger lines and finally the thick synthetic mooring ropes. "Stern is 5 meters, the radio crackled, touching fender. I felt the vibration through the deck, a dull, heavy thud. The stern had made contact with the large rubber Yokohama fenders. Because we had corrected the angle, we hit the fenders squarely, not the concrete. The ship listed slightly to port as the fenders compressed under the thousands of tons of pressure, then righted itself as the hull settled against the rubber. The bow was still 10 meters off. The tug eased its pull, allowing the wind to gently blow the forward section onto the fenders. A second bump followed, softer than the first. We were alongside, but we were not secure. The wind was still trying to push us along the quay or bounce us off. "Make fast the springs," I said. "Keep them tight." The winches whined as the crew heaved up the slack. The forward spring line took the strain first, stopping any forward motion. Then the aft springs were secured. The ship groaned as the lines stretched, fighting the gusts that were still whistling through the cargo cranes. "Tug, stop pulling. Push gently to hold us," the pilot instructed. We needed the tug to pin us against the quay while we ran the remaining lines. On a day like this, we would use a 4-and-2 configuration forward and aft. 4 headlines, 2 springs. We needed every rope to hold the massive windage of the car carrier. I watched the linesmen working on the dock. They struggled with the heavy eyes of the ropes in the wind. It took 20 minutes to get all lines fast. I checked the Doppler log. Speed was 0. The vessel was pin tight. The pilot let out a long breath. He picked up his coffee cup, which he had placed on the console an hour ago. "Finished with engine," he said. I rang the telegraph to "finished with engine." The engine room acknowledged. The vibration that had been with us since the sea passage finally ceased, replaced by the humming of the generators and the howling of the wind outside. I walked to the chart table and logged the time. We were safe alongside. The ramp could now be lowered. The entire maneuver from the breakwater to the berth had taken less than 40 minutes, but it had felt much longer. The margin of error at the stern had been less than 5 meters. Once the gangway was down and the authorities were on board, the pilots signed the paperwork. We shook hands. There was no need for a long discussion. We both knew the landing had been on the limit of what was safe without a second tug. The cause of the difficulty was simple physics. A car carrier in ballast is essentially a balloon. With 30 knots of wind on the beam, the force required to hold it or turn it is immense. The single tug we had was barely sufficient. We had relied heavily on the engine and the anchor handling skills of the tugmaster to keep the drift under control. Looking back, the critical moment was the decision to carry speed through the entrance. If we had slowed down too early, we would have lost steerage and drifted onto the breakwater. If we had been any faster, we wouldn't have been able to stop in the basin. It was a balance of risk. We stayed in that port for 12 hours. The wind never dropped below 25 knots. When we departed the next day, we ordered 2 tugs. It is always better to spend the company's money on a tug than on steel repairs. That kind of day doesn't make the news, but it stays in your memory. You remember the sound of the wind and the look of the concrete wall getting closer than you ever want to see it again. If you've seen something similar during your career, I'd like to hear it.